All right, so today we are going to start our unit that spans quite a bit of human history and also quite a bit of anthropology, you might say, in the sense that we're kind of doing this unit as the archaeology part, and that is what we're concentrating on. It's in the middle of things, and on Thursday we will read more about archaeological methods. It will be a very detailed method kind of section on Thursday. So we're going into some archaeology, but it's within this sense, we're starting out kind of where we left off with some of the what we might say are the end points of our human evolution. Of course, human evolution isn't over, but where we got to with Homo sapiens across the whole planet as a single interbreeding species. That's where we leave off, and today we're going to be talking about how you categorize those Homo sapiens that spread out across the planet. We start there, and then we go into some heavy-duty archaeology, and then we end up in the concept of culture. And so we're in what we might call a period of where we're talking about human history. And the reason I want to overview this a little bit today, and I think it is a nice way to start out this section. Sometimes I put this part at the end of the last section and in that first exam, although I think that would have been a little overwhelming. But it's a good way to start this because it's also the way we're going to be ending it, in the sense that you can't really understand what anthropology was all talking about in the concept of culture without understanding what it was talking against. And so every time we dig things out of the ground and look for what we call civilization and how people domesticated plants and animals, and those things may seem very technical, but they're part of a long history of people, especially coming out of European countries, trying to categorize the world and trying to make it make sense with this other idea that was developed, that human beings come in racial categories, that we come in different kinds or groupings, and those groupings say something about our capabilities. This is something that is actually a fairly recent idea in human history. It came about within the last 500 years that people have these racial groups, and that's what determines human life and culture. But so it's something we then project onto the past. We kind of go looking for these things because it is such an active issue in our world of today. As we all know, we haven't really left the idea of race behind in any way, shape, or form. So we're going to be tackling this idea of race. And I want to do, again, a kind of overview here. We're going to be going back to some of the first things that we learned about anthropology. It's where it came from as a discipline. Anthropology became an academic discipline during what we might consider the heyday or the apex of European and North American colonialism. So during what is the 19th century and early 20th century. And so one of the big questions of anthropology from the beginning is, well, how do we explain why people act differently? Are people all the same? Are the other people that we meet of the same equal human capacity as us Europeans if they were from those areas? And so these ideas that people were determined by their race were also used during this time to justify the way history had gone down, to justify and make sense of the European conquest and rule that had been put into place already. And so it was during this time, and like I said, race in some ways is a relatively recent classification. All throughout human history, obviously people have looked at other people and tried to figure out, you know, what physical differences that they have. But the idea that these physical differences would be grouped as races, and that there were 5 of them or 45 of them or a certain number of them, those developed in the last 500 years in the colonial era. And they continue, of course, through today. We inherited them from an earlier time, but they're not an eternal grouping that everyone has always thought about humans in this way. Something happens since the time of Darwin, in the sense that evolution gets pulled into this mix. And so there were already these ideas that we saw from Linnaeus, for example, these ideas that humans came in 4 or 5 different types. But then in the 1860s, again, from the time of this idea of natural selection and evolution, then that gets pulled into to justify this inequality and to reinforce this idea that certain people were meant to be superior and others were meant to be inferior. And this became known as the idea of scientific racism. And I put that in quotes very deliberately because it actually, well, it was racist, but it wasn't scientific, but it goes by the name of scientific racism. There really wasn't anything scientific about it, as you'll see in a second. This slide is actually already in your notes. If you turned back to the very first day of class, maybe the second day, first day, I think, where we talked about the idea of ethnocentrism, of thinking that your own way of life is superior to another's. And what we were talking about then was that in the European countries, a very specific idea of ethnocentrism developed, which was that we in the European or the West were civilized and those other people out there were primitive or backward. So that is already in your notes. This is already in your notes too from maybe the 3rd class when we talked about the great chain of being and how there's this idea of ascent from the lower animals all the way up. Well, in the great chain of being, it was up to the angels and to God. But as evolution comes in some ways it doesn't displace the great chain of being as much as join those links. And so the underlying ideas remain. So if we put these 2 arrows together, which is what happens with this idea of scientific racism, it's that you combine this incorrect ethnocentrism with an incorrect evolutionary idea, and you get this idea that there's a gap between the civilized man, and I'm using man very deliberately here because these things are also, as we will see in the archaeology unit a week from today when we talk about some of the figurines, these ideas are very gendered as well. We're talking mostly about race today, but the gender stuff is very prominent here as well. So the idea is that there is the civilized man is at the top, and there's a gap between the civilized man and the inferior primitive man, and there's another gap between man and the lower animals. And so the idea is that everything can kind of be ranked along this hierarchy. And you know, this is an idea that is not necessarily causal for things like eugenics or the idea that bad traits could be bred out of a population. It doesn't cause things like the Holocaust, but it does serve as a justification for some of the bad things that people have done to each other over time. It also is one of the reasons we don't learn about Alfred Russel Wallace. You may wonder why, if Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace published together the idea of natural selection, why do we only hear about Darwin and not Wallace? Well, the thing is that Darwin was a better writer, and he wrote some very good books, and he became more famous for that reason. But Wallace, in contrast to Darwin, challenged the notion that there was a huge gap between the brains or the intelligence of the civilized and those of the people that he had actually lived with in other places. So Wallace was much closer to other people in other parts of the world, and he said, it can't be that they are naturally dumber than us. They're actually quite smart and adapted to their own environment. And so Wallace was trying to explain this, and in his efforts to explain this, and his efforts to defend the people that he knew, he suggested that God had created an equal intelligence. And for that, he has been banished basically from the scientific community, because you can do a lot of bad things and still be a scientist. But if you say that you believe that God created something, you're probably not gonna make it very far in the biological sciences. And so his ideas, but he was trying to defend this idea that, or he was trying to argue against this idea that there was a gap between the minds of the civilized and the primitive. In some ways, Wallace was anticipating what anthropology would eventually argue. Now remember, anthropologists are part of this whole schema. They were born during this period, and a lot of them participated very much in these ideas. But eventually, different anthropologists and some of the key founding figures of anthropology would argue that race is not determining of our capacities, of our behavior. You can't figure out what language someone is going to be speaking because of the way they look or because of their head shape. And you can't figure out what culture someone might be able to learn based on their racial phenotype. And so Franz Boas, who we've met before, perhaps in the first class, one of the founders of US anthropology, was also an early, someone who early argued against the association of race with language or race with culture. Anthropologists, in part because of field work, and we will talk about field work and the ethnographic methods more at the end of this unit, could tell us that you can't understand somebody's culture just by knowing what biological race they would be. And this probably makes sense to us. I think we all understand this, that you can have a very different, or I mean, a very same phenotype and yet participate in a very different culture. So race does not map onto culture or describe culture in any way. And Boas was also starting to, although it was before some of the genetic stuff came out, he was starting to understand that our very classification scheme of race was not a good descriptor of the biological differences that could be found in the human population. And that the idea that humans came in these stable racial units, this is something that Boas was working on, was how people would be variable based on where they grew up in their environment, that their body form and head form could change based on where they were raised, which was considered insane at the time, and people still get pissed off at him because of these studies that he was doing. And so anthropology eventually starts to argue that not only race isn't determining, and not only that culture is different from race, but in fact that race is not a good way to describe the biological differences that we see in the human population. And this is a difficult thing for us. Most of us know the first two things up here, but the third one is hard for us to wrap our minds around because we live our lives swimming in the idea of race. And so a lot of us had some troubles with our first try at the quiz because it's hard stuff. So I've put up a grade for you, but you also get a second try. So you can go back into the quiz, see where you might have messed up, and give it another go. It's open whenever you want, but I would suggest taking notes first and then trying it again. These things are hard, and it's hard to wrap our minds around it. It's going to take a few times. You always have to rehearse it because it's opposed to what our senses tell us. It's opposed to the way we've been raised to believe. So as Lavenda and Schultz say, Boas and others were already working on these ideas and starting to get the hints of them before what we call the modern evolutionary synthesis. We've seen this as well. This is also called neo-Darwinian thinking or new Darwinism, because what it did was, we talked about how during Darwin's time, he didn't understand the mechanism of heredity, and that came to us more from Mendel's work with those pea plants and stuff. And so what neo-Darwinism did, or the modern evolutionary synthesis did, was to put together the idea of natural selection, some of those Darwinian selection mechanisms, with this idea of how different traits and genes, eventually we would figure out that they were genes, get inherited in different populations. And we talked about the strength of this synthesis. We also talked about how some people want to develop an extended evolutionary synthesis. But in the 1940s and 1950s, this became state of the art and is still a very important contribution. Perhaps we don't necessarily need to go beyond it, especially when we're thinking about race. And what Lavenda and Schultz say here is that it is exactly, so people like Boas were working on some of these ideas, but it is exactly these Mendelian plus Darwinian ideas of what they call microevolutionary studies, how populations change, were the things that would lay the basis for undermining or discrediting these 19th century, so 150-year ago ideas that people came as biological races. So that's why they asked this question for the chapter, you know, how does evolution undermine the idea of biological race? Most of us never thought about that. We never had that question because we just assumed that evolution helped us understand biological race. But it actually undermines, or it discredits, this idea that humans come as biological races. Like I said, it's not easy to wrap our minds around this scientifically, because we are so raised to not see life in this way. It's difficult to get our mind around it. So I want to start by talking about, as Lavenda and Schultz do, the concept of a species and what a subspecies would be. And so let's start with what makes a species, right? That the members of a species, if they are, I mean, obviously not everyone is going to be interbreeding all the time, but that basically populations in a species can interbreed with each other, and that those offspring are also going to be able to successfully interbreed. So we're not talking about horses and donkeys, I think that's right, to produce mules that then they can't reproduce with each other. In terms of human beings, we are one big interbreeding species all across the planet. So if you take people from Norway and from Australia and from sub-Saharan Africa and from Chile, those populations can all interbreed and their offspring will be viable offspring. And the thing about humans is that when we look across history, we're always doing this. There's countless examples of us interbreeding with each other. We often fight each other too, and we say we hate each other, but in every war and every conflict, when there's always going to be interbred offspring, and whenever populations come into contact with each other, even if they say they don't like each other, there's going to be some of this species testing boundaries going on. We've seen it every time that humans come into contact with each other. And so if we were going to be able to sort people into groups, race, humans are one interbreeding species, and so race would be something like a subspecies. It wouldn't define an interbreeding population. It would be a sub-designation below the species level. Now, many of us believe that the last populations that we could truly designate as races or subspecies of Homo were Homo sapiens, right? So Homo neanderthalis and maybe Homo denisovans were the Neanderthals or the Denisovans. And let's deal with the Neanderthals because we have more physical evidence of Neanderthals for a while. If you remember the last class, we talked about how a lot of people didn't believe that there was interbreeding between humans, Homo sapiens, and Neanderthals. And for a long time, there wasn't evidence of interbreeding. And so they looked pretty different, those brow ridges and the chinless features. And so people were like, nah. For a long time, people considered Neanderthals to be a separate species. And it's only since 2010 that we found that evidence that they did interbreed and that Neanderthals did contribute some DNA that has persisted into this day in the modern human gene pool. But in general, that would have been more like what we would call a race, as in you could kind of tell that they were all of a, getting at the boundaries of the people that you might want to interbreed with, and quite physically distinct and different to the extent that they're on the edge there. They're interbreeding, but it's a subgroup. They're obviously fertile, they can interbreed, but it's getting closer to what we might call hybridization. And so, again, as we saw in the last class, when it comes to Homo sapiens, those of us who are left, we're kind of like a subgroup of pretty genetically homogeneous. That is to say, there's not a lot of differences. There's not a huge amount of differences, one human being to another, of what once was a probably more diverse set of bipedal, large-brained creatures. So if we had Neanderthals and Denisovans walking around here, then you'd probably know it. They'd be more distinct than what we see among Homo sapiens. We seem to be a less diverse clade. Some people call us a relict species because we're kind of the offshoot of something that was once more diverse in the past. So these are sort of basic concepts of species and subspecies, which are important to get our head around when we think about, okay, human populations today. Can someone indigenous to Africa mate with someone who is from the lightest of the northerners? And yes, that can all happen, and it happens all the time. We do it all the time as well. So again, to get to some of this, one of the reasons this is difficult to deal with is that I'd like to pose this as a couple of different questions, which is are there enough biological differences that if we wanted to, we could classify people into groups? And the answer to that question is yes. That is to say, so yes, humans are relatively genetically homogeneous. We don't have a huge range of genetic variation, but we'd be fools to say that we couldn't classify people into groups based on the ways that we actually do vary. So sometimes there are more people around that look different that we can say, even in this class, a lot of people look in a different way. But yeah, people obviously, when we look around at people, they do vary biologically. But the second part of these questions is, could we then put these differences together in such a way that we would have, okay, everyone with a certain type of feature is also going to be linked to another trait so that we can mark off a race boundary? And the answer to that question is no. So we have real human variation out there, but the ways in which that combines and mixes biologically is much more complicated than our traditional ideas that people come in 3 or 4 or 5 different blocks or groups or Linnaean categories. So let's talk about this a little bit in terms of what human biological variation there is. So I sorted this out into the wonderful categories of stuff you can see with your eyes and stuff you can't see. So let's deal with the stuff you can see first. As we all know, humans vary biologically in terms of skin color. And we often believe that we use skin color in order to classify people into different races. But humans, of course, vary in different ways than just skin color. Now, we might think about this. After skin color, what's the next thing that you look at physically to try and figure out what a person might be like?
Maybe like their eye color, their hair color.
I like both of those, but I like the hair most. I think hair is crucial to this, right? We're always commenting on hair color, hair form, so curly or straight, and texture of hair. So this is something that is obviously varies across human populations. And absolutely right. We also can look at eye color. We can look at eye form and eye shape. And obviously people classify different groups based on their eye color and shape. If we want to get down into the elementary school level and terrible jokes about people that I would never want to repeat, we would also talk about nose form and lip form. Fortunately, we can't see any of that anymore because here we are. We don't get to see that. So that's good. But people get very weird about their noses and lips, right? So people would get into that. And those vary, right? There's people with thin noses, thick noses, etc. Nose form varies all the time. This is something you probably haven't commented on much. Do people notice ears much? Maybe we do now. No, we don't tend to notice ears, at least in the United States, we don't tend to notice ears because we do so much hair and skin, right? In other places, so when I first met the people who would be my eventual in-laws who are from the Korean peninsula, and so in the Korean population, the hair form is pretty uniform. It's pretty much, unless you dye your hair, you're going to have pretty much the same hair. And they commented on my ears. And it was kind of interesting because if you don't have other things to go on, you actually might notice how people's ears do vary over geographical and individually and in different groups. And of course, we could talk about the shape of people's heads and how big people's heads are, and we can talk about how tall they are, these things we see, and how they're built. And these are all things that biologically vary. So that's stuff that we can see and we can comment on. There's also variation in stuff we usually don't see. I'm going to start with something that we could see if we really got into it and started doing, getting your criminal record out there, is fingerprints. And those actually vary. They also vary geographically. So different populations tend to have more whorls or hills or valleys. We usually don't look at people's fingerprints unless we're trying to catch them doing something. So I'm including the stuff you can't see. Blood types, A, B, O, and negative, positive, those vary over human groups. We'll talk about the genetic stuff, different genetic groupings. This is kind of a new one that people have talked about different types of gut bacteria that you have, which again vary individually by group and geographically, depending on what's going on in different ways. Malaria resistance, so we'll talk about this. The sickle cell trait is something that varies in the human population as a biological characteristic. And lactose digestion, the ability to drink milk or eat cheese later in life. Whether you will be able to do that is another way in which humans biologically vary. So again, one would be a fool to say that humans don't biologically vary. We do in all kinds of different ways. But the question is, how do these variations map onto each other? Do they map onto each other? And the answer to that is much more complicated. So if we take lactose, for example, it turns out that actually only 1/3 of the worldwide population can digest milk. And so our the campaigns that you see to drink milk have a lot to do with the ways in which many Americans are from places in the north of Europe where people were able to digest milk. And so this is the percentage of the adult population that can drink milk without getting a stomach ache. You may know that if you go into the store now, you can find lactate and various things. So we use culture to modify that, even that as well. But so on the one hand, this maps onto some very light-skinned populations up in the north where they made a lot of cheese. But it also maps onto some very dark-skinned populations, well, we might say medium-skinned in Western Africa. This little dot in sub-Saharan Africa, people in Saudi Arabia, and almost parts of into India, all of these places where people grew up with and over time domesticated animals that were vitally important for how they would later drink milk. So basically what I'm trying to say here is something like lactose tolerance, which is a biological trait, doesn't map onto any particular form of skin color. If we group together all the people who are lactose tolerant, we'd have all kinds of different looking people. Same thing with something that some people consider to be a racial trait, but is actually more complicated than that, which is the sickle cell allele, which grows or occurs in areas in which malaria comes into play. And sickle cell gives some resistance to malaria. And because of the way of our own migration patterns in the Americas and people that were brought to the Americas as enslaved Africans, we often associate sickle cell with African populations. But there are lots of African populations which don't have sickle cell. And there are other populations, for example, in parts of India and parts of the Middle East, and even in parts of Greece and Cyprus, that have a decent amount of sickle cell because malaria was there. So again, if you put these people together and say, aha, we can group them by sickle cell, you get very different looking people in the same category. There's another another map of the percentage of the population that has the B allele. And we could do different blood groupings. And what we find is there's nothing that is unique. I mean, there's obviously different percentages in different populations, but when you group people together based on A's or B's or O's, you're going to get different groupings, and that these gradually fade out and vary over time, which leads us to this crucial idea, which is the idea of clinal variation. So most of the features that we see as varying among human populations vary gradually over a geographic range. And so this applies to skin color perhaps most famously, but it applies to a lot of the other features that we talked about as well. And other features can be, as we know from Mendel and genetics, can be combined and recombined in different ways. There's not a particular skin color that goes with a particular nose shape. There are people that have, thin noses of every skin color. So all of these things vary independently of each other. They do not co-vary, or they do not concord with each other so that we can sort people into these kinds of types. And if we try to map them onto each other, which, trust me, people have tried this over and over again because everybody wanted to find the groupings. But if you map on lactose or malaria onto skin color or height or build or hair or eye form, all of these things would produce different groups, different ideas about how human beings could be sorted. So again, human biological variation is real. It's important, but it doesn't sort well into our traditional race categories. And so one of the things we do need to do is not to try to categorize people into groups, but it is good to explain why it is that humans do have this biological variation. Some of the biological variation can be explained by natural selection. So the distribution of sickle cell trait is a natural selection mechanism that arises in places where there is malaria, and malaria is a mostly lethal disease. Sickle cell trait, though, is also can be quite lethal if you get both of the recessive genes for it. It can actually be lethal from very early on. And so the reason I say that is it's an example of something that is only adaptive in a very particular environment. If the environment changes, then it becomes a very maladaptive thing. So it's good in a way, even though it hurts a lot of people, it eventually can be successful as a natural selection mechanism. But it doesn't mean that we all want to get, we definitely don't all want to get it. And now that we hopefully can be able to do more to eliminate malaria, we want to not have the sickle cell variant as well. So it's an example of something that can be adaptive in a certain environment, but maladaptive in another environment. The other possibility, or one of the things that can also help to explain human biological difference, is the idea of sexual selection. And Darwin, actually, although you probably didn't learn about this in high school too much, he wrote about sexual selection, or how people and other creatures choose mates based on things that they consider to be good for mating. And so this is it's an important evolutionary mechanism. I've underlined here that it might help. In some ways, you would think that with ideas like race and hair and eyes, those are also things that people put on their want ads, right? When you're looking around for someone, those are things that we notice, and we usually call people or think about people as beautiful based on different characteristics like that. But it's very difficult. I would say that a lot of people tried to explain skin color and other things through sexual selection. And my own feeling is it hasn't worked that well as an explanation in the human population. But it is an important thing to think about. I mean, it's completely difficult to avoid that people do check each other out when they're trying to figure out who to have children with. A lot of biological difference, though, is also random. And so fingerprints, for example, there's not really a selective pressure that would mean that certain populations end up with a higher percentage of a certain kind of fingerprint. That is basically a consequence of gene flow or genetic drift. These mechanisms are things that happen basically at random when a certain population goes further out than others and gets a little bit isolated, and then they come back in with certain genes. And so some of these traits group up in certain areas, not because of selective pressures, but simply because that's the population that happened to break off and populate that area. And then I should also mention that, you know, a lot of these traits are complex to figure out. Genetics has, as we talked about, is a lot different than it was in the time of the Mendelian idea of one gene, one trait. And so especially with human traits like skin color, they are influenced by a whole bunch of different genes all across the genetic system. And also we know that one gene might influence a whole bunch of different traits. So it's a complicated process, which also mixes with our environment and where we are raised. So these are things that help us to explain why there is biological variation, and explain without necessarily having to try and categorize or even attempting to categorize people into groups. As many of you notice, one of the interesting things about human beings, and one of the things that we talk about the most is skin color. And we believe that our racial categories are based on skin color. Skin color in human beings exhibits almost perfect clinal variation. Maybe I should say perfect clinal variation. There's no, if you line up all the human beings from fairest or lightest to darkest, there's a continuous variation all across. There's no line. So different people have tried to come up with schemes to measure these things. This is one of them, the Besuiti's skin color variations, which, as you can tell, goes from the number 1 over to the number over 30. So these are, you know, you put something on your arm and be able to tell, match it up closely to a skin color. And basically what we can say from this is that the populations, and I've used the year 1492 here, because this is before people started traveling across the oceans to each other. And so these are the populations that would be indigenous or native to these areas before transoceanic travel. Now, people have been moving around forever, and that's what we've been talking about, is these human migrations. But at this time, if you took a walk from the far north down to the equator, there again is no line at which you cross over from one group and you would say, aha, I've crossed over from white to black here. I found the village where it happens. No, you'd see continuous variation. And most people believe that there are different natural selection elements involved in skin color, having to do with skin protection against excessive sunlight, and also having to do with vitamin D absorption, especially in the northern hemispheres. So if people we talked about human evolution happening mostly in Africa, and as people moved into some of these northern areas through the Middle East, there were different depigmentation or the loss of pigment as people moved in these areas. And then you see a similar thing going on in the Americas, where when you are closer to the tropics, the skin color gets darker again, not quite as dark as in some of the in other areas. And that may have been a repigmentation of people who lived in those areas, or it may have been that they did not depigment as much if they moved into these areas around the equator. So again, this is if you walked from east to west or from north to south, you'd see gradual variation all along these routes, and you'd see different parts in which people have different kinds of skin color, you might say. So we tend to associate dark skin colors with Africa, but those also occur very much in indigenous Australian populations and indigenous Papua New Guinean populations, and in parts of India where you see a whole different range of skin tones. Our idea of race, that these skin tones come to us from race, is a product of the colonial period, in which people from one part of the world started sailing down to another part of the world, bringing people into the Americas, enslaved Africans into the Americas, who would then interact with people who were indigenous to the Americas, and you'd put them all in the same place. And so instead of walking from one place to another, where you'd see gradual variation, you brought these different populations into contact with each other in the context of the new, what was called the New World and the Americas, and the rise of plantations and ownership of the land and the dispossession of indigenous peoples in the Americas of their land. And so you'd bring these different populations together in a particular way. If you notice, there are certain populations that get almost completely left out of US racial classifications. So there's a huge variation of skin color, for example, in India, but we don't know what to do with it. We don't understand it because it wasn't part of the colonial experience. And so we don't really include that as part of. And so, we don't know what to do with someone who would be Aboriginal to Australia, who might be quite dark skinned. Do we classify them as Black? They didn't participate in this colonial experience. And so our ideas about where people fall racially is based upon the kind of labor and productive regimes that were set up under the colonial encounter, in which people started moving different people around transoceanically and then putting them together in ways that they would not necessarily have come into contact when people were mostly walking around from place to place. So in some ways, our ideas about that there are 3 groups or 5 groups of human beings is based on a strange sample of the human population, basically the people who ended up in the Americas. And so now when we see people from, Saudi Arabia, the US doesn't know what to do. We're confused because we didn't develop a classification scheme for all the peoples under colonialism.